Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. Today we have, he might be the most frequent guest in Power Hour history. He's probably at least top four. It's Michael Lynch. He was the second guest ever on the show. And the reason I keep bringing him back is he tends to be right about a lot of things in terms of oil markets. And that is rare. So I think it should be rewarded. And today he's got a really interesting paper we're going to discuss, which talks about the very real and unacknowledged threat of a lot of oil production shifting away from the US and toward the Middle East and other places we might not prefer it to be concentrated. So Mike, welcome back to Power Hour.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you again, Alex, even if it's only virtually.
Yes. We had our one encounter when we did that event at Harvard.
Yes.
That you graciously agreed to come interview me for. That was nice because they allowed me to invite my own interviewer. Just one of my more pleasant interviewers that I've had, given that I got to choose him.
You haven't been banned from Harvard based on the subject of your talk?
Well, we don't know, right? Because that's the last time. We don't know if it will be the last time I've been in Harvard, but that was the last time. You know, there have been traveling to places hasn't been encouraged so much.
Yes.
So we shall see. I'll bet I'll make another trip there at some point in my life. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about just broadly, what is this paper about? And what's the title? If you remember the title, it's got a long title.
The title is The Evolution of the Oil Industry and the Impact on Energy Security, something like that. And it's under the scenarios of the energy transition. And it started because the IEA released a new net zero 2050 scenario and said, you know, if we're going to meet this, people have to stop investing in new fossil fuel deposits like oil, gas, and coal. Just, cease it altogether right now, not cease production, but stop new projects. And that has some pretty significant geopolitical implications that the IEA just ignored, which is funny because that's the whole job is that their origin is in energy security and coping with things like oil embargoes from the Middle East, supply disruptions and so forth. And they've kind of thrown that aside.
So it's really not appreciated. So you think about when people think about exploration, what they often do. So I think the way it can be viewed is, we're not going to have any new oil, but we're going to have the same amount of oil if we stop exploring, which is weird that people think that because of course it used to be, we're going to run out of everything immediately unless we discover tons of new oil. So it used to be realized that oil actually declines in a given area. And I think you cite the figure of 5 to 10%, depending on location. And so, it's pretty damn scary to think about the supply of oil declining even 5% a year. And they're just not taking that into account.
Yeah. And it's, or they're just, the amazing thing is they kind of assume that the decline will be relatively even geographically. That is, the US will decline some and Russia and the Middle East will decline some. When, the Russian oil companies are not going to listen to the IEA saying you have to stop investing to save the planet, nor will most of the Middle Eastern companies, I think. They're all state-owned oil companies, and some of them have announced targets about, trying to achieve net zero in 2050 or 2060, but usually using carbon sequestration or switching over to blue hydrogen or something, not ceasing production. So, when you think about it, the industry generally spends something like 80% of its money replacing fields, decline in existing fields. So if you suddenly stop doing the new field investment, then you get declines at different rates in different places. So deep water declines a lot faster than shallow water or conventional oil, and shale declines very fast. It depends on the basin and so forth. But if you believe that the shale oil companies are going to listen to the people who say you're going to leave these assets in the ground, you're going to lose money, You should well also embrace capital discipline, which they're usually not that good at. But shale oil production would drop very sharply, and U.S. imports would go up pretty quickly. And the only people who are going to be able to replace that are basically in the Persian Gulf area.
So we're going to talk more about what are the factors likely driving this, but I want to go back in history and just like why this matters. So, we had this thing called the 1970s. I didn't have it because I was born in 1980, but I've read a lot of stories, and I was at the beginning of it as an infant. But like, what was it? Because, and I guess the other context is the last 10, 15 years, the US has had this dramatic growth story in oil production. And so the issue of energy security has become even more on the back burner. We used to talk about a lot, we're so dependent on Mideast oil, so nobody seems to care about that anymore or fear that. Yeah. But what was it like, let's say in the 70s, when we were heavily dependent on Mideast oil?
Well, the important thing is that oil production in the 60s and 70s soared around the world, but mostly in the Middle East. Their market share went through the roof. And the market was very tight going into the first oil crisis in 1973. So when you had the Arab-Israeli war and the OPEC members, that is the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, declared that they would embargo countries that didn't support the Arab cause, but also said we're going to start cutting back production until there's peace between the Egyptians, Syrians, and the Israelis, and there was no replacement oil available. The market was just completely flat out before that happened. So all of a sudden, you find demand growing 5% a year, and you're losing 5% of supply. And you had gasoline lines everywhere. Prices shot up. People were kind of convinced it was the end of the world. I'm told Al Gore, I can't find the actual reference, but I'm told he claimed he saw tankers hiding in the fog. And, a lot of people blame the big oil companies for creating the shortage, apparently not having read the newspapers. And that began this came after books like The Limits to Growth and The Population Bomb. And so you had a lot of people saying, aha, this is a new age of scarcity. I have a book. I don't know. Do you know Jeremy Rifkin, the famous?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Not personally, but
okay. I noticed he's now a great expert on climate change and the transition. He's keynoting a Financial Times address, despite the fact that pretty much everything he said has been wrong for most of his life. But he had a book called, God in the Age of Scarcity, and he said, it's 1979. He said, aha, this is permanent. There's going to be no oil around, and we all have to live with this. Economic growth is going to grind to a halt. But it was interesting because at the first oil crisis, almost all the oil being traded internationally was in control of the Seven Sisters, the big multinational oil companies. And what they did was they basically kind of shifted oil around, so everybody got roughly the same amount, which is not enough, but about the same amount. And this despite the fact that a number of countries said, we deserve to be treated differently. You shouldn't cut us off. And there were cases where the oil companies said, if you order us to deliver oil to you, we will have no choice, but you have to do it publicly. And the prime minister of, for example, England just wasn't willing to do that. In the second oil crisis, the Iranian Revolution, what happened was you had all the oil loss was from Iran. Most of the other oil was the production was under the control of the national oil companies, but they generally then sold it to the Seven Sisters, who then delivered it. Well, when they lost the Iranian oil, they started cutting back the customers in Japan or Germany, for example. And those customers then ran into places like Algeria, Libya, Kuwait, and said, we need oil, we'll pay extra. So they started cutting off their existing customers, who then went out looking for more oil. And at the same time, you had all the governments like France and England and the US and Canada saying, wait a minute, we deserve to get our fair share, and putting pressure on the oil companies, but which didn't really work. But by 1990, you suddenly had a big change, which was you had a huge spot market. Something like 25% of the oil in the world was sold on the spot market. So when you lost oil from the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, there were ready supplies out there. People didn't panic and go crazy. So the concern is that in the future, you don't have a spot market. And instead of having a lot of private companies buying and selling oil, you have national oil companies in China and India buying oil. And then almost all of the oil being produced would be produced by Kuwait Petroleum Company, Yukos in Russia and so forth. And so the distribution of the oil in a shortage could be very much determined by politics. That's my big concern.
I mean, what are the general hazards of dependence on, I think you make this distinction, not just imported oil, but oil imported from hostile or semi-hostile countries?
Well, you always run the risk that, for example, you had cases with Libya under Gaddafi.
Libya's behind you, right? Just so,
yes, that's.
We haven't commented on your background yet.
Those are my peeps. They're out campaigning for me. I heard the prime ministership is open. I hear the job tenure doesn't usually last very long though, so I don't know. Anyway, so Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the Iranians would sometimes say, we don't like this country, so we're not gonna sell it to them. We will make sure that our friends in places like Cuba and North Korea get supplies, and that's a bit of a concern. It's not so much a problem on a day-to-day basis now, but if there were, say, another war in the Middle East or a revolution in Russia or something like that, then all of a sudden you have a new scramble for supply, and the people who have it will have a lot of political leverage. In 1973, when the OPEC producers said, we want people to make a statement supporting, I forget the exact term, something like justice for the Palestinians. And most of the Europeans, the Japanese, all immediately said, yes, we support this now. We've been ignoring this. Now, all of a sudden, we realize it's important. So that affected the politics. You also had kind of this big movement, which is completely forgotten now, the new international economic order, where a lot of the countries in Europe especially said, the future is to the countries in the South who have resources. Resources will always be more and more valuable. We should make all these political and economic concessions to them. And that lasted for about 6 or 8 years until all the prices came crashing down, which is what they usually do.
Interesting. I just got distracted by that because I had never heard of that school, actually.
Yes, it's the Foreign Affairs had a classic article, and essentially it goes back a little bit to earlier days when people in Europe said, we have to help our former colonies by giving them guaranteed prices for their cocoa exports, their tin exports, and so forth. But this was seen as much bigger, and it was sort of, okay, the North has to sacrifice financially to help the South develop because they're going to have power, political power, stemming from their control of all these scarce resources.
So going forward, do you expect? Well, first of all, let's define terms. So what's OPEC and what's OPEC plus?
OPEC is essentially, I think it's 13 countries now. The major producers are all in the Middle East. Nigeria, Angola, Libya, Algeria are much smaller. Venezuela used to be big, but they've just fallen apart. So they control about 35-40% of the world's oil supply. And then OPEC Plus is countries that volunteered to assist OPEC several years ago when the price was weak. Some of them are small producers like Ghana, for example, and Azerbaijan. Oman, Mexico are more significant, but the big ones are the Russians and the Kazakhis, I guess. And they essentially agreed to cut some production, originally thinking this is just a temporary shortage. And then the pandemic hit and they said, this is a big crisis. So they all agreed to cut back seriously. But most of these countries, most of the production is in the hands of national oil companies. Oman is a mix of the government-owned oil company and private companies like Shell. Mexico is obviously all the Pemex at the moment. Kazakhstan is something like 40% is owned by the government, and then private investors like Chevron make up the rest.
What are their plans going forward? Because from what I saw, there was an OPEC report like a month ago or so, and they seem to be pretty eager to keep producing a lot of oil. I think Saudi Arabia said something like, "Oh, we're going to be net zero internally, but we're going to have no restrictions on how much oil we produce and sell."
Yeah, and it's I can't fault them, because almost all the advice the Saudis have gotten from the IEA and the U.S. government over the last 40 years or so has been bad. Jim Schlesinger, the first Secretary of Energy, flew into Saudi Arabia in 1978, and he said, "Well, you're better off leaving the oil in the ground. It'll only get more valuable. Producing it and putting the money in the bank, you'll lose money," which was actually wrong. And based on apparently one short research article somebody did. But then he was there to say, please produce more oil. So he's sort of saying, it's dumb to produce more oil, but we want you to. The Department of Energy and the IEA have long had this Malthusian bias towards oil supply, and they've almost always said everybody but the Middle East has peaked out. And so future oil demand has to be met by more supply from the Middle East. The Department of Energy went so far on a number of years to say we're going to need 25 million barrels a day from Saudi Arabia in something like 10 or 12 years. And of course, it's never been, if they built that capacity, it would have just rusted away. So they're a little wary about that when people say, we're all going to be net zero, especially when they then see President Biden flying to Glasgow, getting in an armored limousine, which probably gets 3 miles to the gallon, and an escort of a couple of others, and joined by all these people flying in on private jets and such, and saying, "Oh, by the way, we need more oil because people really want cheap energy." So but someday, it's just like me saying, "I'm going to have chocolate cake for dessert, but I'll lose weight in 10 years." Yeah, trust me.
I need a better, and I'm trying to think of a good analogy for that, because my thing is that's a good analogy, but then I need something to capture the fact that it would actually kill you to do net zero in my view. But it has that kind of commitment. Yeah, that is like, oh yeah, I'm going to eat all these calories, but then in the future I'm going to have none, or I'm going to have far fewer. Yeah. I imagine they see us as like useful idiots almost. I mean, I have a similar view with China, just that because I don't think anyone who knows the facts about energy use and likely demand can think, oh, we're actually going to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. And so I don't know, do you would have more insight into their perspective than I do?
I haven't had time really, or money. If you want to donate a few million, I'll be happy to accept, to go back and look at all the pledges about energy people have made in the last, say, 40, 50 years, or 50 years since the first oil crisis. Very few of them are kept. Usually what you find is the government likes to set big targets, knowing that they don't do anything to meet those targets. I had in the 1980s, I had a number of conversations with Japanese utility executives, and I said, well, according to the government, you're going to add 2 major nuclear reactors every year, and that will reduce carbon emissions. And they would laugh and say, we're not building it. We're not going to build any more reactors. We've sort of reached a peak. We flattened out. And I'm like, well, and they're like, nobody listens to the government. I hate to say it, but yeah. And, similarly, the U.S., every president since Richard Nixon has said, we need energy independence. And then Nixon had price controls, which increased consumption and reduced production. And, the people who've done the most for energy independence are probably Ronald Reagan, who decontrolled prices, and George Mitchell, who developed hydraulic fracturing. And the vast majority of other things that governments have said that, they don't go anywhere. And I still, I find it hard to believe that people are taking this even remotely seriously, watching now the pollution problems in India, The New York Times, if you go to I think it's page 4 or page 6, they had an article about the pollution, and people saying the government's been promising to reduce this horrible pollution. It's killing us. And they haven't really done anything. And you sort of go, oh, but are they going to somehow go to net zero in 30 years if they can't even stop the local pollution from coal and brush fires and firecrackers? And, it's just, this is where cynicism, I think, is born, or certainly matures. Anybody who's been in this business for a long time just doesn't pay too much attention to pledges.
I think one thing that I worry about is the more the idea comes out that this is doable, like if only we could have the will, like we can get to net zero in X time, or we can get to 100% renewable next time. I think it leads to the justification of restrictions on production and transport. And I actually place a lot of blame on a lot of the current problems here, but you have one great line, which was you begin it with "of course," but I don't think people will notice it because you said "of course," but you say "of course." Efforts to discourage the production of oil are entirely misplaced since consumption is not driven by supply but demand. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I've said, I think I said in the paper, I forget, I've written 3 different versions of it. Narcotics policy was based on, if we can just stop the people from growing poppies and coca leaves, then nobody will want to use this stuff. And that's all of the efforts have had, from what I can see, virtually no effect. People don't say, oh, Exxon is not going to produce as much oil next year. I think I'll go trade in my car for a smaller model, or I'll move back into the city into a big high rise or something like that. No, it's just more a question of, we're afraid to blame the consumers, to say it's you people driving. We want to say instead, oh, it's those big bad oil companies and the car companies that advertise. You wouldn't want an SUV unless it was, except because it's advertised to look really sexy. And this goes into, it's kind of a nanny state thing, which is, oh, you'd all buy what I think you should buy, except it's somebody else's fault. It's not human nature. It's, it's Madison Avenue, or it's Detroit, or it's Houston. And it's just nonsense. If you watch Who Killed the Electric Car, they sort of go, oh, if only they advertised it with women in evening gowns, people would have bought them. Well, people didn't buy the Edsel, And I did find, I was amused to find Time magazine had an article, the 50 worst cars of all time, and they mentioned the GM EV1, which is what that pseudo documentary was about.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, part of what, if you look at what's happened in this administration, I think what scares me is that in a sense, it's in their immediate control to shut down production. So you look at the initial actions, or transport, right? So you shut down Keystone Pipeline development and then have this moratorium on leasing in federal lands. Like, that's the opposite of, oh, let's innovate something that can actually outcompete oil on some time frame. And so is that a microcosm of what's happening, that we're saying, oh, we're going to go net zero, so let's start by restricting our production and transport. But if you can't really change the cost-effective superiority of oil, then we're just going to be getting it from abroad.
Yeah, and I can't. It's hard to know if they're just playing political games and posturing, or if they really think they're. I mean, I'm sure some people think it has an effect, but it's like the Dakota Access Pipeline. The protesters said, "Oh my God, putting this pipeline across this river, under this river, it's a big threat to the purity of the river." And the oil that was going to be in the pipeline was already being shipped over the river in train cars. And you sort of go, this sounds good to block the pipeline, but in fact, the impact is negative. You find people are often, it's the old cognitive dissonance, which is I can believe 2 completely contradictory things at the same time. And politicians seem to do that. I mean, Joe Biden says he wants good union jobs. And some of the best union jobs are in the oil industry. They pay a lot more than construction. I mean, putting up solar panels is basically just construction, and the union jobs, the oil field jobs tend to pay 50-100% more than that. So his problem is, he wants to promote the union jobs. He doesn't want to kill union jobs, but at the same time, he has this segment of his party that says, "Oh, we want you to stand up and do something like block the Keystone XL pipeline."
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance thing I find scary, particularly today, that I think politicians think they can just say things and it'll just, like, it gives it a reality. Like they're going to say, we're going to get off, I promise you, look me in the eye, we'll get off fossil fuel.
Yeah.
Or like this, people will look back 50 years from now and this infrastructure bill and reconciliation bill will like revolutionize. And it's kind of like there's something in their mind, but it's also just really, oh yeah, I'm saying it with a lot of confidence and I'm president, so it must be true.
I can't think of how many times I've heard a politician say, we're going to end hunger, we're going to end homelessness, we're going to end poverty, and sort of say, well, first of all, going to zero anything is not, you get into diminishing returns and rising costs. It's not, but also poverty's been around forever. And you think you're going to end it? Like, no, they can't really believe that. You can reduce poverty, maybe, but you're not going to get rid of it. So it's kind of the same thing here, which is it's kind of a fantasy world where, unfortunately, you'll have somebody who'll publish something and say, oh, renewables are really cheap. And that's why we need to subsidize them heavily. So is your picture in the dictionary under cognitive dissonance? I keep trying to figure out, again, I haven't had time yet. I've been putting together some numbers on the cost of solar and wind. And there are a lot of places where wind is pretty cheap, especially if you don't use battery backup. But, people are not putting in solar unless there's a lot of subsidies, and pretty much anywhere. In the desert in Chile, yeah, it's great. But when you talk about Northwestern Europe, where it's cloudy, a lot of the time, the solar intensity is much less. The land is more expensive. The labor is more expensive, and so forth. So people will go, I was really embarrassed to see former Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz, who's an MIT professor, smart guy. But somebody said, oh, in Dubai, they put out bids for solar power and it came in at like 2.7 cents a kilowatt hour. And he's like, wow, solar really is cheap. And I'm like, yeah, probably the land in Dubai is free. The government gives it. The solar intensity is as high as you'll ever get. And I'm pretty sure they're not using labor being paid at German level wages. They're probably all South Asian workers who are being horribly, not let's just say they're not living in the lap of luxury, I suspect. So, the comparison, but then you still get people, I hear people all the time, go, well, wind and solar are cheaper than coal. And it's like, well, why is India and China building lots of coal plants? And the answer is, well, it's not really true unless you finagle the numbers. And unfortunately, most people don't look at the numbers very carefully, as you know.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot in my next book, Fossil Future. I should send you a copy of, come to think of it. I call this partial cost. Part of it is what I call partial cost accounting. So, when you're dealing with the grid, you just run into this accounting issue that it's really one integrated system. And so if you want to prove a point about the cost of something, you can just look at some cost in isolation. And anytime somebody says bids, I basically know they're trying to defraud me, because what is the bidding? The bidding is part of this process that treats uncontrollable and controllable electricity the same, as in you get paid the same. And then the bidding is not necessarily what you pay for it, because of the way that the pricing works. So you can end up you can say, okay, I'm going to bid this, but then you get paid the clearing price for everything. I've talked about this with Meredith Angwin before. She talks about this in her book. And so, the general thing is, do you have a way of using these intermittent sources that really subtract a lot of the controllable infrastructure costs, that they can, like, if you can really get by with a lot fewer gas plants and not a lot of transmission, then maybe you could make it work. But usually they're not getting away with much reduction in the controllable infrastructure at all. So it ends up being cost adding. So there's so much accounting deception / fraud when it comes to electricity, and I think everybody should just be aware that that's a possibility.
I think about 25 years ago, there was an article in the Energy Journal where they looked at demand side management, and some of the people who were saying this is too cheap to meter. It's like the investment it more than pays for itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually, Amory Lovins was one of the big advocates, and I wound up debating him in Washington about 10 years ago. And I said, the old joke is an economist and an engineer are walking down the street, and the engineer says, look, there's a $20 bill. And the economist says, there can't be. If there was one, somebody would have picked it up. So the engineer picks it up. And I said, Amory, you're saying there's $20 bills lying all over and nobody's picking them up. And this article in the Energy Journal said, well, just as you say, they're looking at certain very specific costs, but they're leaving out a lot of the costs, so that in fact they're understating the cost, and thus it's nowhere near as attractive as the claims of the advocates are. And I think that's also true. I also wonder where we seem to be heading into an era of increased NIMBYism. There's a solar project proposed near me, and all my neighbors have signs up saying, we want solar and forest. Don't cut down the forest to put in a solar project.
I imagine your neighbors are mostly Democrats.
This is a very liberal area. But it's also, there was another project where somebody was going to take a field that had been farmed but was no longer being farmed. And people said, well, maybe we want to use it someday, and so we should not do it. But if you say, okay, we're going to build all these wind towers out west, and maybe the farmers would be happy to have them, the ranchers, but then you got to build the power lines. And we just had a power line from Canada to Massachusetts blocked by Maine residents who said, we don't like you cutting down some trees, but also we're not getting the power. Why do we care to help out the people in Massachusetts? Which, I don't agree with that attitude either. But when you think of the problem of the fact that, if you have a natural gas plant here, you produce the power here. If you're relying on solar and wind, the solar, the sun moves, the winds change. So you're going to have to shift it around a lot, the power around a lot, and unpredictably. And it's going to mean a lot more redundancy, but also just a lot more infrastructure, and a lot more land use. And I think people are starting to realize that. And that's where you're starting to see some blowback against the whole movement, I think.
Yeah, I talk about this a bunch in Fossil Future from two perspectives, because one is that it's not being accounted for in these rosy claims. And you see a lot of maybe I don't know if I'm going to name specific names, but some of these people involved in these reports for the government saying, oh yeah, we can do solar and wind really quickly. Like, they really deliberately omit these infrastructure costs and the opposition. Robert Bryce has been really good at pointing this out, that there's just so much opposition. And it comes from the green mentality of we don't want to impact things. It's NIMBYism, but it's justified by, well, it's wrong to impact the forest. It's wrong to do this. It's wrong to do this. But so they're not being honest in the projections. But then also it shows the whole philosophy that you can't really build anything if you're really trying to be green in the pure sense, because we can't impact nature with CO2, but we also can't create new radioactivity. We can't dam rivers, right? Because it interferes with the salmon, and we want free flowing rivers. We can't build transmission lines. We can't construct these new things. We can't do the mining. So it's ultimately an anti-energy movement. And that's what I find so objectionable, is at its core, it's anti-energy, but it pretends to be pro-energy. And part of how it does this is these bogus projections that do not factor in its own anti-energy opposition. Like, all these solar and wind projections are made by people who would oppose those things if they were actually buildable.
What I love is when I hear of like a utility scale solar project, and people refer to it as an industrial solar project, as opposed to some kind of craftsman solar project done by women weaving solar panels in their during the winter months in their back rooms. Organic solar. It's again, it's you hate to. You don't want to lump people together and demonize them, but there's an awful lot of people out there who are being at least disingenuous and possibly dishonest. But some of the math is, with the peak oil thing, part of my point was, you had geologists doing statistics and they didn't understand statistics. So they didn't realize that their answers were wrong. So it's kind of the same thing with the solar people, where if you remember back in the 90s, in California had a zero emission vehicle mandate. And people finally started to say, it's not really zero emission, it's remote emission. There's emissions somewhere in the building of the car, but also in the, the power generation, unless you have a completely zero emission grid, which is, even solar panels, it's a lot of metal and there's a lot of manufacturing involved. You have to ship it from China a lot of times and so forth. So the problem is people have this sense of, there's an Eden out there. There's some completely untouched place because, the human touch is bad. Misanthropic. You have to go back and reread Gulliver's Travels in the final book, where he comes to hate humanity in favor of the intelligent horses, which, he has some good things he has some fun stuff to say about academics too. That I love. But you wind up saying, okay, you don't like consumption, but you're wearing clothes. You're wearing Birkenstocks. You're wearing North Slopes.
North
Yeah,
Face.
I'm not a fashion plate, so I don't know what they say. You want to have all these wonderful things, but it's kind of like the people in the communes who say, well, we want to live in this nice supportive environment, but we can't support ourselves, so our parents are going to have to kick in money. And it's unfortunate. And the problem is politicians and governments are often influenced by these people because none of them spends any time studying these. So if they find, say, a Stanford professor who says, oh yeah, we can go 100% renewable, it's easy, they go, oh look, see, it's easy. My favorite story, which I wish I could just inflict the penalty on modern politicians, during the Irish potato famine, an English lord got up in the House of Lords, of course, and he said, well, there's new research that shows you can live quite nicely and healthily on a diet of grass and seaweed. And I thought, did anybody ask him to demonstrate that? So, I read about people and they go, oh, I can live completely off the grid. Of course, I'm an investment banker and I can spend, an extra 50, 75% for a well-insulated house with solar panels and expensive battery backups. And, you can do it. It just costs a lot of money. And I would argue, as, you often make the point, we have better things to do with our money than to, give subsidies to Hollywood movie stars to buy Teslas.
Yeah, apparently we don't, because we are now contemplating encouraging a $12,500 EV credit,
Yeah,
but also
but only for you
on using Joe Biden favored union labor.
This is, people will write and say, oh, well, look, Norway's going almost completely EVs. And you go, yeah, there's like a $60,000, $80,000 subsidy, and you get to park for free and all this stuff, and they're rich as Croesus. This is not the big question.
Don't they have some oil there?
Yeah, and they're still investing in oil. Funny thing about that, Thomas Friedman wrote a piece about, oh, Denmark is doing all this great stuff in renewables. Like, yeah, they produce all their own oil too. So it's, you can't somehow get through to people in most settings, because this is I think it was Thomas Kunin's who wrote Unsettled. Have you read that? Steve Kunin, yes, sorry. It's a great book, and he says, let's have a real panel and debate these issues seriously. And people just were not interested. They were like, well, we believe what we believe, and we're not going to listen to anybody else.
I had him on the show. I've had him on the show twice actually since that book. I know he had some upcoming debates. Actually, I need to check if they happened, but I heard there was even going to be one at MIT.
Oh, that would be good. I thought I saw something about that, but also there were objections to that. And this is, you have people often in debates like this who, they sort of go, oh, I have the moral position, what I'm doing is science. And you should not question it. And in fact, people should not publish you. People should not allow you to speak. I had that in the peak oil debate when I published in the New York Times an op-ed. There was something like 250 responses, most of which were, "You're an idiot." A bunch of which said things that were just completely wrong because, well, they heard it somewhere and they assumed it was right. But a bunch said, "Oh my God, I'm canceling my New York Times subscription. How can they produce this drivel?" And there've been other scientists like Julian Simon, where people said, "Oh, your argument against, the population disaster, it's dangerous. You shouldn't be allowed to speak." It's, I
By the way,
would
that New
like
York
to.
Times article, I think there were two, but I remember the first one. That was the best thing I ever saw in the New York Times. I'll tell you that. I was so shocked that they printed it, and that's how I learned about you, and that's what eventually got me to invite you on the show.
There was one guy on the editorial page who invited me 3 times to write pieces, and he then moved on. And I don't know if they got, if the editorial board saw all these responses and said, "Oh my God, why are we publishing this guy?" There were a whole bunch of there were a number of people who published responses to that piece, and I read one in Mother Jones, and the guy could have asked me, said, "Oh, these people say this about you," and I said, "Yeah, that's actually wrong." you know, Things like that. And just both the New York Times and the Economist had just like a piece online, which was unauthored, which said, "Well, I'm not convinced Lynch is right because there are people who disagree, but I'm not really sure." But other places like Foreign Policy published a peak oil guy saying this is nonsense. All these people like Lynch and Jurgen and so forth are just shills for the oil industry. And some of them are still out there and writing. I know some of them occasionally say nasty things about me, but I haven't seen. No, excuse me. I've seen one person admit he was wrong. This is Joseph Rahm, who used to run the Climate Progress.
He said what has he admitted he's wrong about? Because in my view, he's got a long list of things.
Well, okay, he's a physicist. He published something on his blog page, but also on the Huffington Post. I'll send it to you later. And it was like, "Often wrong, Michael Lynch has now said that," and he challenged me to, well, he challenged me in writing to a price wager. And he just had a bunch of quotes from people that he said, "See, this proves he's wrong." And he quoted something I had done 20 years earlier. No, 10, 12 years earlier, but he got it wrong. We had both appeared at a congressional hearing, and he basically read, I don't know, the executive summary of my report. But he said, "Oh, well, look, it's clear." This is 2009. "It's clear that peak oil is here. It's just that the debate is settled. I'm sorry to even write about this, but Lynch has got me upset." So my brother actually responded to him and said, "I hate to tell you this. If you saw the way my brother lives, you'd know he didn't sell out to the oil industry." And I think he sort of apologized. "Well, I didn't really, I don't really know anything." But then 10 years later, he said, "Well, I guess we were wrong about peak oil supply, but peak oil demand is real." Yeah. So he actually admitted he was wrong. He didn't apologize to me. In fact, none of the peak oil guys ever did. And you catch people out and you sort of go, "Well, don't you admit you were wrong?" And occasionally you'll have somebody say, "Well, I got better data and now I realize something different." And I've seen economists in other settings sort of go, "Oh yes." And you go, "But 10 years ago you said, oh, but I ran the data and here's the answer. It's certain." And now you're saying, "I reran the data, I got a different answer, but it's still certain." And trying to explain to people who do these econometric analysis, I just got a long paper about technological forecasting. And it's very interesting, and they get great econometric results. "Oh, this looks great. We can fit this model." And it's like, yeah, but your data is no good. It's especially people say, "Oh, look, solar's so much cheaper than it was in 1965. It's like, yeah, 1965, the solar panels were built for satellites in outer space. That's why they were so expensive then. And they were built in small labs by Boeing or somebody. So, that shouldn't be on your graph at all. They have gotten cheaper. But just to say, oh, they're getting cheaper over time, it doesn't work that way. How much is it that they're cheaper because you have cheap labor in China or Chinese subsidies? How much because you have economies of scale with bigger factories? And, that people just don't talk about that. They just pretend that, oh, if the government subsidizes it and we buy a whole bunch, the cost will come down. And now we say, yeah, let's do that for nuclear power plants. That's a good idea.
The subsidy, that's such an interesting thing with, there's now this mythology that really the government can subsidize anything and it can be infinitely cheap. You just hear like, oh yeah, we want to do carbon capture and it costs this astronomical amount of money, but we're going to come up with some subsidies, or we're going to come up with some grants, and our goal is to get it to X. And like, if you could actually do that kind of thing, then you're the greatest investor in the world.
Well, and they point to things like the video cassette recorder and say, see, once they started, they offered it cheap and the volumes went up and they got economies of scale. It's like, yeah, and the government didn't subsidize them. I'll let you in on I'm going to publish a Forbes column soon. One of the big mistakes people made in the 70s was they said, okay, assume oil and gas prices go up forever and that solar and wind go down forever. And they cross in 8 years. Mm-hmm. Except solar, gas and oil went down and solar didn't come down that much. But what you have now is if you read the World Economic Outlook from the IEA, they actually have technology costs in the back, real and projected. And the interesting thing is they say, well, assume that gas turbine costs stay flat and natural gas prices go up and solar and wind costs go down. And that's a huge flaw. Because one, they've almost always been too high with their oil and gas price forecast. But two, gas turbines have gotten cheaper over time. The data is not great. I'm still putting that together, but they do, just like most things, a piece of steel today, if you made the same one, 20 years ago, it would cost like 30% more. Productivity tends to improve on almost everything over the long run. And costs tend to come down, and that will be true for gas turbines. I personally think you're going to see a big reduction in the cost of nuclear power with the small modular reactors. And, if you get cheap electricity from a small modular reactor, maybe carbon capture looks a lot better. I haven't run the numbers yet.
Yeah, I mean, some of these things, carbon capture has a lot of difficulties, but it's just this faith that we're going to allocate this chunk to this approach, to this technology, and then it's going to automatically go down, versus realizing, oh no, wait, things go down because there's freedom of competition and certain people get it right. And that's what drives it down. But not that the fact that some people have done it on a competitive market does not mean that you can do it with an arbitrary subsidy.
Which takes us back to Dr. Joseph Rahm, who was in the Clinton administration, and he was like a renewables expert or something. And they promoted the Partnership for a New Generation Vehicle. And they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll have all the oil, gas, car companies come in and work cooperatively to develop a hyper efficient car. I think in the end, the only thing that came out of that was the little rear facing cameras that were intended so you could get rid of your rear view mirrors and have better air efficiency. But in the end, Ford and GM both announced cars, and they showed them off. I have pictures of them in one of my slide sets. They never produced them. And it was, the government was like, well, if only, because it's industrial policy writ large, or writ small, I guess. If only we told you what to do, we in the government, because we're motivated by the good of humanity and you're motivated by profit margins. And that's where you go back to Adam Smith, who said, if everybody tries to make things better, then everything will get better, generally speaking.
All right, we got to get back to this paper for a few minutes, although I've been really interested in what we've discussed. So summarize for us, what are the major factors driving away production from the U.S. and toward OPEC plus?
Well, in some countries like the U.S., Denmark, probably Norway at some point, there's political opposition to allowing more investment. You also have political pressure from the ESG, environmental and
social governance.
I think it's corporate governance, which I don't know why the C steps out. But, telling the banks don't loan money to fossil fuel companies. And you have some of the banks saying to the shale oil producers, especially, your profitability has been terrible over the last 10 years. Stop drilling, drill less, pay down your debts. The bigger threat is banning a possible ban on fracking, which I don't know how that could be done legally, but just trying to reduce production on federal lands, which the Gulf of Mexico is almost all federal lands. There's not a lot of oil production on federal lands, fortunately. The Permian and the Bakken are mostly private. But just the general idea that you have people saying, don't invest in the oil industry because these oil fields are all going to be abandoned in 10 years. That's the carbon tracker argument. They're all going to be abandoned. And, all the money you invested will be lost. So people should not buy the stock. People should not loan the money and so forth. I don't think it will work very effectively. I recall there was a widespread boycott against Shell during the days of apartheid, and Shell is still here. 20 years ago, a number of environmental organizations sponsored a ban the SUV movement, and people were supposed to slap bumper stickers on all SUVs saying something like, I'm destroying the planet or something, which living in a very liberal area like Amherst, I can tell you the SUVs have not gone away. In fact, the market share for SUVs has been going up faster than it's much greater than the market share for electric vehicles, and it's still going up, including in places like China and India, which is a little surprising. So, it's trying to tell consumers you don't really want the things that you think you want because we've decided they're not good for you. Nobody's closed down a McDonald's for health reasons. I like McDonald's, by the way. Don't tell my wife. People, it's kind of the wrong target. The whole fear that the earth couldn't support us all, couldn't feed us all, and we'd all be starving to death by 1980. And instead we have a problem with obesity. Well, I sure do. I don't think you do, Alex. You look like you're in good shape. But or in the 70s when they said, oh, we're running out of natural gas, let's all burn coal. And that arguably was a lot dumber, just from the pollution. And I don't say that because my family produces natural gas. We produce a very small amount of natural gas, unfortunately. But I do think, coal is kind of nasty, dirty stuff. And it would be nice to see it backed out by natural gas, nuclear, some wind and solar, depending on the place.
Well, I don't feel, I love coal. In part because, in terms of energy for poor people and as the technology for harnessing it improves. I just always think about billions of people using less electricity than a refrigerator. And coal is a lot of their help. So yeah, all things being equal, if everything were equal in a given context, including price, yeah, you would choose gas because it's easier to burn cleanly. But
if
that's
you have the money
that we live in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why India burns coal, is because they can't afford it. And frankly, you're better off with coal-fired electricity than burning dung to cook your food, because dung has a lot of noxious stuff in it. And, I was really irritated. Somebody published a study. Somebody estimated that in, 20 or 30 or 40 years, 1 million people a year would be dying because of climate change. The World Health Organization, which is a pretty neutral organization, estimates at present 1.7 million people die a year from indoor air pollution, that is burning biomass, instead of using commercial energy, meaning electricity. So, this goes to your whole thesis, which is that, wouldn't these people be better off, building better sewers, but all having electricity to live on?
Yeah, that's definitely still my view. Any other variables we should be thinking about in terms of driving away production from the U.S. toward the Middle East and Russia?
Well, the other thing is that the IEA argues that because people will use less oil due to climate change policies, not because of price, that will push the price down. The cheapest oil in the world is the Middle East. U.S. shale is relatively expensive. If the price goes down, as they say, you will see, and nothing is done, say import tariffs or something, you will see a lot less oil in Canada, the Middle East, the North Sea, the U.S., deep water Atlantic, like Brazil, Ghana now, Guyana, and so forth. So that would theoretically be a big problem. The thing is, the oil companies look at the IEA forecast and they sort of go, yeah, well, the price now is 80, so we'll set a target price of 50. If we can make money at 50, we'll invest. They're not going to say, oh, in 20 years the price will be $25, and so let's not invest. But that would be theoretically a big factor if it were occurring and if people believed in it.
Yeah, and I see some of those scenarios involve, I think, was it that the sustainable development scenario involved lower oil prices?
Yes, and the net zero shows prices basically crashing. I think they go down to something like $30 in 2030, which
I would love anyone who wants to bet me on that one. You want to bet me that restricting like a world where you're having draconian restrictions on fossil fuel use is going to be one of low prices? And any amount up to and including all my savings, I will bet.
Well, sadly, I had some peak oil guys who wanted to bet me that the world oil production would never pass 92 million barrels a day, and it hit that about 10 years ago, I think. But unfortunately, I didn't take them up on it. But it's the problem is trying to argue that human nature is wrong just doesn't work. I mean, I'm sorry. People like stuff. There are, I have a picture of Simeon the Stylite, who was, I think, a 11th century hermit. And he thought the material world was a bad thing. The spiritual world was a good thing. So to keep himself as far away from the material world, he stood on top of a tall pillar, like a 12-foot high pillar, just to stay that much further away. And he had people pass him up food. And it's like, yeah. And, we remember him because nobody else did that. They used to have, in the Middle Ages, they had anchorites, who were people who would go to a monastery or a convent, and they would have themselves bricked into a room, and food would be shoved in and the waste would be shoved out. But then I read some of them would have servants in with them, for example. So, even those people believed, in the consumption of physical goods.
I think it's always, you can put it as human nature, but also it's, you could also think of it as like the requirements of survival and flourishing. And I think, one thing I really dislike about the anti-energy movement is they just really demean people's goals and choices. Like I'm not much of an SUV. I don't even drive a car. I ride an electric skateboard and I ride Uber. So I just care about things with large back seats. And so I prefer minivans to SUVs because they have more room. But having a car that's attractive, that you look at every day as attractive, like that's a meaningful thing to people's lives. And just nothing seems to, the only meaningful way to use energy, as far as I can tell, for the climate catastrophists is to fly a private jet to Glasgow. That's the only moral use of energy that they seem to acknowledge.
Yeah. Or to import sparkling water from Italy or Fiji to serve
net
at
zero.
Your Glasgow
Fiji
conference.
is carbon neutral. That's what they say.
Oh God!
It's a hydrocarbon bottle imported from Fiji. Oh, I need to take them on in my next. That'd be good for my energy liars series. I just did Budweiser the other day. Fiji would be a great one. I would love to see the math on carbon neutral water from Fiji.
I was telling somebody in Japan, he said, "Oh, we're working on carbon trading," and I say, when I think of carbon trading, there was a Dean Koontz thriller, and the serial killer, as a sideline, he put ads in magazines saying, "I'll sell you, if you pay me, I will plant trees in the rainforest." And he had a little post office box, and people would send him checks, and he'd just cash them. And it's like, there's a lot of greenwashing out there, and I read years ago, Fair Trade Coffee. They said, "Oh, we're doing such a good thing. instead of paying them 50 cents a pound, we pay them 75 cents a pound. And I said, yeah, but you're selling coffee instead of at $4 a pound, you're selling for $9 a pound. So it's kind of like Robin Hood saying, I steal from the rich and I give to the poor, minus shipping and handling.
The carbon trading thing. I don't know if you ever saw the Seinfeld where George comes up with a fake charity to give people gifts. It's called the Human Fund.
Oh,
it's
no,
just
I didn't see that one.
It's the Festivus one. And it's
okay.
Anyway, the motto is money for people. Just like they might as well do that with the carbon scale. It's just like, give me money and CO2 will be reduced somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I tell you, I've spent most of my career listening to people say, well, people in the third world, we've developed a solar cook stove. And I keep seeing people announcing that, mostly academics saying, oh yeah, we've designed this, it works great. And nobody seems to buy them. And I did see one article once where they said, well, it will cook like baked beans, but it doesn't cook the traditional foods of the people in this region. They need it much more specifically. And I looked on Amazon and I just briefly, I think it was like a camp stove, solar powered camp stove was like $300. And I thought, you can buy a lot of propane for $300. And especially to sort of say, somebody we were joking on Twitter, it's like, darling, I love you. I'm going to rush you to the hospital, but you have to wait till the sun comes up and charges the car. Or I think it was the NATO Secretary General who said, oh, we could have a solar main battle tank. And I said, the Battle of the Bulge was almost a disaster because the planes couldn't fly in the clouds. What are you going to tell your army? Oh, we're only going to fight in the desert. Don't worry.
Yeah, the scary thing is just when these get more and more, like they're willing to sacrifice more and more things, like, oh yeah, let's do this symbolic thing we don't really understand for the whole existence of our country. Like, let's handicap ourselves in war. Yeah, I'm sure China is in love with solar tanks.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm sure they'd be willing to sell us the technology. Yes,
and use it. It's like using 84% fossil fueled economy to produce our solar panels and wind turbines.
Yeah.
So got to wrap up. This is really fun to talk to you. Let's remind people where they can learn more about your work, including this paper.
Okay, the paper is at eprinc.org, eprinc.org. You can reach me at lynch@energyseer.com. So that's energyseer, one word.com. And I need to update my website and put a lot more. I'm also on Forbes.com. If you just search my name, you'll see I produce a column roughly once a week.
And you're on Twitter, right?
I'm on Twitter as Laughing Economist, but it's not spelled that way. So it's LAFFNG Economist, something like that. Search me, you'll find me.
You gotta have a better spelled Twitter name. I have a nice Alex Epstein.
Well, Laughing Economist had too many letters, so I had to shorten it.
Yeah. So I think if they search Michael Lynch,
yes,
they'll find it. All right, Mike, thanks so much for being a voice of rationality and energy, and look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you. Keep fighting the good fight, Alex.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.